Schemer. I'm the director of the Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilisations here at American University. And I have the pleasure of introducing a distinguished guest, Rami G. Before doing that, I also warmly recommend to those who haven't met before or have the first time to take one of these blue small note things and please come or warmly welcome to another event whenever it is. Anyhow, Rami Khouri, hard to introduce, and I did it yesterday, so I'll see if I can remember what I said yesterday. The educated Switzerland, the US, I even think I know where you were born, I think it was New York. But after education, a very distinguished career in two fields, media and academia. In media, a famous person who has worked for a number of publishing companies and presses, among them being the editor-in-chief of Jordan Times and executive editor of Daily Star, or vice versa. Also at the same time being at Daily Star and Jordan Times, Rami Khouri was writing and publishing with International Herald Tribune, Boston Globe, Washington Post, and other very famous media outlets. I also think it's important to mention, and repeating what I said yesterday, that throughout the career he has kept a relationship to academia. So that has been in kind of two ways. One is through being constantly throughout his media career a guest or a visiting person at different think tanks and universities. Among them, Harvard in different capacities, the Belfer Center and John F. Kennedy School. Belfer Center just recently voted the best think tank in the world, and also other think tanks or universities in also the Middle East, but primarily Middle East and the US. Later in life, he was also, let's say, about 12, I think, years ago, the founding director of the Isam Forest Institute for International Public Policy and International Affairs. And in that capacity, he built Isam Forest Institute to a famous, if I may say so, player in academia and Middle Eastern studies in general. And now, after retiring from that position, he is now an adjunct professor concentrating on his own writing. And today, the title, Erratic Governance and its Consequences for the Citizen-State Relationship, I think, if I'm correctly informed, relates to a new book project of yours. So, warmly welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Leif. Thank you all for coming out this evening, and thank you very much to the Institute and the University for inviting me here and hosting me for these 2 days, which have been very informative and enjoyable for me, as I've learned a lot from chatting with students, faculty, staff members, and seeing old friends and walking a little bit around the neighborhood. It's been an enjoyable and educational experience, and I appreciate being here with you. And I'll try to repay you a little bit by sharing with you some thoughts about an issue that I think is really at the heart of what is going on across the Arab world, and that is the broken relationship between citizens and states in most Arab countries, not all of them. In fact, if it's not broken in all of them, it's certainly not clearly established by the free will of citizens and leaders in all of them, in the sense that most citizens in all Arab countries virtually have no serious say in governance issues, and certainly not in the establishment of their power structures and governance systems. So in some cases, we have really broken relationships, and others we have relationships that are very docile and quiescent. But we have serious problems in the broader issue of erratic governance. And I'm talking about the last 100 years, really the modern Arab worlds, and it was in fact almost exactly 100 years ago, 1917 or so, 16, 17, that the modern Arab world was invented in this city to a large extent. We've had 100 years of statehood, and it's been pretty inconsistent and erratic. We've had some good decades of serious development and really improving human relations, human conditions, and we've had some erratic downhill trends in the last, say, 40 years approximately. So I say erratic because we've had good years and bad years, good decades and bad decades. But today, when you look at the Middle East and the Arab world, in the Arab world in particular, we see some really terrible things going on in terms of desperate citizens, fraying societies, broken internal systems that used to be defined by integrity are now dissipating and scattering, and people who used to work closely together are cutting each other's heads off, or you have ethnic cleansing going on, you have mass refugee flows. Half the citizens of Syria have either left the country or been displaced internally. The savagery of the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State, terrorism, violence, corruption. I mean, there's just so many terrible things going on. And I'm talking mostly about the Arab world. This is not a question of Islamic societies, nor is it a question of the Middle East as a whole, because you have other countries in the Middle East, Iran, Turkey, Israel, and others, where not all of these terrible things are happening. But across the Arab world, we have a common problem. And I believe it's a common problem of erratic governance leading to the broken citizen-state relationship. And that explains, I believe, many of the things that are happening, with other factors thrown in. So I'd like to give you my analysis of what is actually happening, the reasons for this, what can we blame for the terrible things that I just mentioned, these things that are going on, along with other terrible things like, 3/4 of the Arab countries being severely water deficient because they're totally incompetent at managing their God-given water resources. I mean, that's a very simple human management problem, government management problem. And most Arab countries are failing this test, as well as many, many other things that we can talk about, which I'll mention some. But so there's a wide range of problems across our societies. And they're mostly problems that are man-made, actually mostly man-made, because women have very few roles in creating these problems, because they have very few roles in governance. We're not suffering in the Arab world problems of acts of nature or acts of God. In fact, acts of nature and acts of God have given us tremendous assets, material and spiritual assets. Almost everything that's going wrong in our societies we can ascribe to bad governance, as well as external factors, foreign countries invading us, nonstop foreign militarism since Napoleon, in the late 1800s until today, nonstop foreign military invasions, attacks, and they're increasing. The pace is increasing. If you look at the United States, Britain, Turkey, Russia, Iran, France, and other foreign countries, Israel, attacking Arab countries militarily, that's much bigger scope now than it ever was before. So there's a lot of different things going on. But my main point is that at the heart of this is citizens who only in recent years, the last 25 years or so really is the problem since the end of the Cold War, only in recent years have large numbers of Arab citizens become, first they were fearful, then they were uncomfortable in their daily lives for various reasons, material, political reasons, and then they were worried. They became concerned, they became fearful, and then they became desperate in many cases. And that's when you started to see the killing and the terrorism and the sectarianism and the trying to swim to Europe and all the terrible things that we see, there's been a progression of these events. And if we look at the underlying conditions across the region, and we now have a much better idea of both the material dimensions of life, in other words, water availability, education quality, labor force, demographics, those material things, we can measure them now much better than we could 30, 40 years ago. And more importantly, we have significant insights now, which we didn't before, into the attitudes, the mindsets of people across the Arab world. Self-perceptions, people's sentiments about, are they feeling positive about the future? Are they worried about the future? People's views about their trust in their government or lack of trust, their sense of the legitimacy of the political order they live in or not. We didn't have any of this information 30 years ago. Those of us who lived and worked in the Middle East could sense these things simply by living there and talking to people. And we knew that there was a deterioration going on in how average citizens looked to their governments. They were getting increasingly worried, starting in the 1980s. So that was known to people who were researching or working in the region. But now this is public knowledge because people have been doing surveys, public opinion polls, on the ground research, and then also there's other things that have emerged, which are helping us understand the emotional and political sentiments of people rather than just their material well-being in terms of water or jobs or income or whatever. So we have a much better picture now of what people feel around the region, what are their complaints, what are their really existential fears. Why are some families getting into little rubber dinghies with their 2-year-old kids and trying to take a boat to Europe, knowing that the likelihood of dying is great? Well, the answer is very simple, that the fear of dying on a boat to Europe is less than the fear of staying in their own country. I mean, that's a terrible verdict, but that's the reality, that people are so concerned about the conditions of their lives and the lack of opportunities for their children that they'll take the risk of walking overland to Europe or getting on a boat or doing something else like that. And that's a terrible reality that we have to address. It's not enough just to criticize people and say, or just criticize governments, or say that parents shouldn't do this to their children. We're not in the situation of families who have 4 or 5 or 6 children, none of whom are getting a decent education, none of whom can ever look forward to a reasonable job, and the parents themselves have no say in how their countries are run. We can't put ourselves in their situation very easily. So it's not for us to criticize anybody who takes their kids and puts them in a rubber dinghy and tries to go to Europe, but they do it, and they continue to do it, some of them, or do other things, join criminal gangs, join militant groups, engage in acts of violence or terrorism, or retreat from the public sphere and just go into their tribal organizations or their community organizations or their religious organizations. So people are doing unusual things that they didn't normally do in the Arab world. And this is what we have to understand. And what we can see broadly when we look across the region is that these problems in the Arab world, this broken citizen-state relationship, these are recent, because in the first half century of statehood, from say the 20s till the 70s, there was a sustained upward developmental trend. And this was the nation building phase, state building. There was massive developmental gains that were made because we were starting from a very low level of development in most of the Arab world, except for some cities along the Mediterranean coast and a few others. Most of the Arab world was very underdeveloped during the Ottoman years. So we started at a low base, but there was steady progress from the mid-20s until this 1970s, and there has continued to be progress since then in many areas. If you look at the development of some of the cities in the Gulf, if you look at all the Arab cities, you see buildings, you see all kinds of amazing things happening. So it's not a question that development just stopped. But what happened in the period roughly between 1975 and 1985, and we can verify this with statistical analysis of per capita GDP and other things, and citizen attitudes of their subjective well-being. This is clearly documented now with the social science work, is that the majority of citizens from 1920s to mid-70s felt that their lives were improving and their children's lives were going to get better, because that had been the case for 50 years in all walks of life: education, healthcare, housing, employment, whatever. But after the mid-70s into the mid-80s, you started to have three things that happened. Most of the political systems and the governance systems were seized by often family-based military security regimes. The monarchies are separate. They have their own systems, and those have persisted. But in almost all the other Arab countries, you had governments that were taken over by military rulers. So you had the Saddam Hussein, the Assads, the Zain Abidin bin Ali, and across the board, you had these military coups and whatever. And then families basically coalesced around them, and rule became very constricted in the hands of a small number of people. The second thing that happened, this started in the 1970. There was a bit before, and a bit afterwards. And that kind of rule has persisted, that political decisions are still tightly controlled by relative small numbers of people in a political class that dominates most of the region. The second thing that happened is that population growth became way faster than economic growth. The Arab population was around 60 million in 1930. It's now around 400 million. This is one of the highest population growth rates in the world. And the Arab economies that were growing consistently for 60, 70 years, by the 1980s, partly because of oil price fluctuations and other reasons, the growth rates simply could not keep up with population. The economic growth rates could not keep up with population growth rates. So you started to get a polarization in society where smaller numbers of people continued to get improvements in their lives, and larger numbers of people started to see their life conditions flatten out, stagnate, and then gradually go down. So you had greater disparities in society that were not so clear before, after half a century of sustained development. And the third thing that happened was that because of these two reasons, economic stress and political autocratic assertion, you started to get large-scale corruption. And this shows up a lot in the data, especially of attitudes of citizens, where you get surveys that show that 70, 80% of people in the Arab world think corruption is rampant and can't be stopped. And it clearly shows up in recent surveys, recent studies by scholars who've interviewed members of ISIS or Al-Qaeda or militant groups like that who've been captured or imprisoned or whatever, and they talk a lot about corruption as one of the reasons why they did what they did. So a lot of people who become disenchanted with society do so because they sense that these trends are continuing. And if there's a common denominator running through this transition from the first half of our modern development to the second half, and that turning point of mid-70s to mid-80s, it's the transition from a population that was increasingly hopeful and improving its life condition to a population where the majority started to be less hopeful and then more fearful because their life condition was not improving. And the critical element, and this came out in the Arab Uprisings of 2010, 2011, this mass uprising, which is unprecedented in our region. The critical driving force seems now, we know from a lot of research, from a lot of good scholars, that it wasn't that people were poor, and it wasn't that people were politically weak and helpless, because they've always been politically weak and helpless. Arab or average citizens in the Arab world never had political power. Their parliaments were not serious, their press was controlled. I mean, there was no serious mechanisms for individual Arab citizens to participate in decision-making or holding power accountable. They didn't mind that for 60, 70 years because their lives were improving. But what happened starting in the late 80s and into the 90s and after the end of the Cold War in particular, when the two superpowers essentially reconfigured their relationships, pulled back a little bit from the region, and basically left the systems in the Middle East to resume their historical development. Because during the Cold War years, these lids from outside, the Soviets and the American-led NATO people basically kept a lid on any internal development in the region because they supported the leaderships, and therefore there was essentially relatively secure states. There were day-to-day security. There wasn't a lot of bombings in the street. There wasn't a lot of ethnic cleansing. There was very little of the problems we see today between 1945 and 1995. After that, we see a lot of these things happening, partly because the Cold War ended and these lids were lifted and the region resumed its historical development, but it resumed it in a context in which the majority of people were getting more fearful. And the single biggest driver of this new period was not, as I said, poverty or political powerlessness. It was the sense that that families were never going to be able to have a chance to improve their well-being ever again. That they felt for the first time ever in modern Arab history, large numbers of people, my estimate is around 50% of the 400 million Arabs, about half of them were living in really precarious conditions in terms of their income covering their expenditures, in most cases not covering their basic family expenditures. They'd have to borrow or steal or beg or do corrupt things or go to charities or immigrate or whatever. About half of the Arab populations are living in extremely stressful conditions. And there's a lot of survey evidence to support this. But their fear was because of the control of power by this small family-based security-anchored elite in most of these countries, there was no chance ever again of a large-scale improvement in conditions of life. That's what was different after 1975 from what happened from 25 to 75. That you always had elites in the Arab world, urban elites, industrial elites, economic elites, social elites. You always had small groups of very rich people, a small middle class, and then a large sort of lower middle class, lower income and agrarian societies. By the time we were into the 1980s and 90s, the populations were getting to be heavily urbanized, dependent on wage labor, dependent on government services for everything they needed in terms of healthcare, water, etc. And so life had become very different 15, 20 years ago than it was 70 or 80 years ago. And this was the critical difference, that there was a kind of a mass, or at least a widespread desperation. And I use that word carefully, but I think accurately. People became desperate for their own well-being, for their future. And not only did they sense that they had no chance of ever improving themselves, they also realized that they had no way to even do anything about it. They couldn't complain about it. They couldn't bring about political change. They couldn't hold power accountable, even though in both Islamic traditions and in Arab tribal traditions, it was clear, ordained by God or by their tribal affiliations, that if they had unjust rulers, they had an opportunity to change them. They had an obligation to speak out against injustice. against corruption, against incompetence, against mismanagement, that this was a divinely ordained right if you're a Muslim. And for others who are not Muslims, or who are Muslims but maybe not so religious, in tribal Arab traditions, in village traditions, if the rulers were making life difficult for people, then the people had an ability to improve that situation, not to live forever in that kind of situation. And what we've seen in the last 40 years is a series of early warning signs. I called them in an article that I wrote recently. Going back to the 1970s, we saw a succession of very clear early warning signs across the Arab countries. And keep in mind that I'm talking about the Arab world. Iran, Turkey had different signs of change. You had the revolution in Iran. In Turkey, you had the slow growth of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamist movements, who eventually took power, and now Erdogan is doing his thing. So there were different kinds of changes in those kinds. But in the Arab world, we could see a series of really important developments in retrospect, and even when they were happening, many of us were talking about them and writing about them. But they showed that there was real serious problems in our societies. One of the earliest signs was in the 1970s, an incredibly fast expansion of Islamicization of personal life and political life. The Muslim Brotherhood basically became suddenly much bigger all over the region. You had small groups of violent Islamists, the people who killed Sadat and the people who did an uprising in Syria in the 80s, but for the most part, it was nonviolent, peaceful, mainstream Muslim Brotherhood type movements became suddenly really big, and people became more religious. And that was a sign of something in their lives that was not right, and they were looking for succor or comfort or hope or something. The extremist movements, the small groups who became violent, were also another sign, but they were very small in number, and they were defeated by the strong reaction of their governments. Another sign was the significant immigration of some of our smartest and brightest young people from the Arab world, some of whom are here today, and some of whom are in the US and Canada and Australia and other places, that the best and brightest of our young people in the 1980s started to leave for different reasons, economic reasons, social discomfort. Some minorities felt uncomfortable as the security state and family rule took hold, as corruption increased, as life became more expensive with the fast pace of development that happened for a few years in the 70s and 80s. Inflation grew and disparities grew. So this large group of people who were in the middle class or lower income, politically or economically or socially or religiously, felt uncomfortable, and many of them left. We started to see in the 1990s signs of low trust in the institutions of governance. And this came through studies, occasional surveys that were done, not so much done publicly, but done privately. We saw signs in Egypt and Jordan and in other countries, where Morocco, where studies were done. We saw signs early on that a large number of citizens were not confident that their government could keep serving them anymore. After 60, 70 years of expecting and getting a lot of good services from their government, we saw low signs of hope for the future. And this is linked to large-scale immigration, and it's linked to large-scale religiosity in daily life. Polarization and poverty disparities started to increase. You could start to see the signs in some of the analyses that were done. Labor informality started to grow. I'll give you some statistics in a minute. I'm just mentioning these titles. Educational results started to deteriorate. You started to get universities that were built to take 4,000 or 5,000 students were teaching 40,000 students. And of course, they were graduating graduates who really were not well educated at all. The same thing was happening at primary and secondary school level. The deterioration of quality of education, which had been quite good in the 40s and 50s and 60s across many Arab countries. Labor informality, people just not able to get a decent job with health insurance and pensions and minimum wage, were just doing anything to get $3 or $4 equivalent a day. And then, of course, you had the uprisings, the Arab uprisings of 2010, 2011, a massive vote of no confidence in the status quo, unprecedented, not only in our region, but maybe in any region in the world, where an entire region shows simultaneously mass citizen protest against the established order, in some cases with street demonstrations, in other cases not necessarily on the street. But you could see it in countries where there was no big street demonstrations. Everybody was home watching Jazeera and cheering on the street demonstrators. It was so clear anywhere you went what people felt. And this came out again in the surveys that were done in the last 10 years. And then you had the rise of Al-Qaeda, you had the rise of ISIS, and these small militant extremist groups that did not have widespread support at first, but were again a sign of something terribly wrong. And these were some of these, all of these signs emerged successively, starting in the early mid-1970s until now. And the real question is, why did our societies not do anything about any of these signs? Well, they didn't do anything because the people who controlled power felt that they could just keep things in control with development aid, and they try some education reform, they try some job improvement programs. They would, the governments were trying to do the best they could in most cases, but they never had the resources, they never had the management capability, and most of all, they never had the will to consult their own people in a serious participatory process where citizens and governments together could identify the weaknesses and come up with solutions, which is how things should be done in a decent society. But citizens just were never really given that opportunity. The mechanisms of participation were always constrained by the ultimate ability of the ruling power elite to bring a halt to any serious change. So parliaments, elections, civil society, the media, all the instruments of normal citizen participation in society developed in many countries to a certain limit, and they could not go beyond that limit. If people tried to go beyond that limit, they were stopped by the state, which had the power and the legal authority. This is what's very important. So when Arab governments would put somebody in jail for writing in the newspaper that there was corruption in this ministry, or somebody asked for a parliament that was actually more representative of the entire population in terms of its ethnic or religious or social or tribal or gender or other breakdown. When somebody publicly asked for something like that, the government could take that person and put them on trial. And it was legal. The governments were not breaking the law, they were enforcing the law. But it was a law that was written by governments that were not always representative, or not sufficiently representative, and that did not sufficiently keep up with the needs of their own citizens, starting in the 1970s and 80s. And this led us gradually to the situation we have today, where I mentioned yesterday, for some of you who are here, we don't have an Arab world as we had in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. There was a common sense of shared conditions, shared legacies, shared values, shared heritage, among Muslims, shared religion, and even among Muslims and Christians, and the few Jews that were in the Arab countries, not many. There was a shared sense that we belong to these Arab societies. So if you go to Morocco, where there was a significant Jewish community, an Arab Jewish community that was still there in the 70s and 80s, Christians all over the place. I don't know what the exact number of Christians is. I think it's around 20 million Christians in the Arab world. And the vast majority who were Muslims, they all felt that they had a common Arab destiny, a heritage and a common Arab destiny. It was never fully defined. It wasn't that we were one country. We weren't one country. We were 22 countries. And that's how history made us, and that's what we inherited, and we went on trying to develop our countries very well. But by the 1990s and 2000s, and in recent years, we started, this common sense of identity and destiny started to fragment and shatter. It shattered on two levels. Within countries, you had great stresses and fragmentation within countries, and it shattered regionally, where the rich and the poor and the various ideological groups started to separate from each other. And what we're going through now is the second great fragmentation and reconfiguration of the entire Arab region. The first one was in the period 100 years ago, when this region was reconfigured largely by European hands, but not totally, because there were some countries that were created by Arab military, local military groups that conquered people around them and created countries in several places in the Arab world. And that's the tradition historically of how countries were made. And it still happened in the Arab world until the 20s and 30s in some cases. And then you had the division of the region into countries largely by colonial handiwork. But this fragmentation and reconfiguration that's going on now is a little bit different, because a lot of the driving forces for the fragmentation are because of internal stresses that I mentioned, and the reconfiguration of the region. So Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Somalia, Lebanon, Palestine, maybe one or two others, have been really severely shaken, and in some cases shattered in the last 30, 40 years by various kinds of wars and conflicts. And some of them are trying to put themselves back together in new configurations. We don't know where that's going to lead. We don't know if it's going to work. And we certainly don't know what's going to happen as the final outcome. But what we do know, which is fascinating, is that much of this is being driven by internal actors, which was not the case so much in 1920, whereas foreign actors had the biggest say. But what you see now all around the region are local actors who are playing a much bigger role, non-state actors, as well as official governments, as well as regional governments. This is the second great factor that is different today from back then. You have regional actors today: Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE to an extent, Qatar to an extent, are all, and Israel, when it tries, it doesn't have many opportunities, but it tries now in Syria, they're trying. You have regional actors, Arab and non-Arab, who are intervening in the affairs of other states because they feel it's in their national interest. That's what states do. I'm pretty critical of countries that invade other countries, but that's what countries do, unfortunately. And if they have militant leaderships who want to use military force, they do this. And so we see this now happening all over the region, with internal stresses and fighting and civil wars and tensions, regional actors intervening or supporting rebel groups or whatever, or setting up bases in regional Arab and non-Arab countries, and the foreign powers, of course. Since Napoleon, they haven't stopped, and they're, the Americans, the Russians, the British, the others are actively involved in some of these wars, like in Yemen, like in Syria, in Libya, and other places. And this is the second great reconfiguration of this region that's going to take place. But it's taking place unlike 1920, when we had, 50 million people or something. It's 1930, we had 60 million people. In 1920, there was maybe 25 million people or something. It was the whole region, the entire Arab world. Today we have 400 million. So you're dealing with a much smaller magnitude of citizens, of national identities. There was no real national identities. There was tribal identities. There was urban identities. And you had less desperation across the board. You had a lot of poor people. It was underdeveloped region. But you didn't have people dying on the streets of hunger or being killed by bombs or terrorists or like it's happening today. The magnitude of the problems were very different. Then. But the most important thing is that this current reconfiguration and fragmentation is taking place in a context in which almost every single major pillar or foundation of modern life is deteriorating. And what I mean by that is things like education, water access, transportation quality, jobs, labor force participation, political rights, human rights protections, poverty levels. You take any measure and you take away that 10% of the wealthy Arabs in some of the Gulf states and some of the urban centers in Amman and Cairo and Beirut and Damascus and Casablanca, you take away that 10% at the top who are very wealthy and they'll fine, they'll take care of themselves. The other 90% of the Arab world is really in a much more distressed situation. I estimate that of that 90%, well, about 30% are probably what we would call middle class. They're okay. They're school teachers. They work in a bank. They maybe run their own bakery. They're people who have a decent income. They can cover their monthly needs. They can maybe take a vacation once a year. They're not desperate, but they don't have a big cushion either. But they're okay. They're not desperate. And then you have 60% of the rest of the population. Of that 60%, I would argue that around 50%, that means around 200 million people in the Arab world, are living in really stressful, existentially frightening situations in their own perceptions, that they don't have enough money. If they have a healthcare emergency in their family, they don't have enough money to take care of it. They've got to figure out what to do, or they might not do anything. They're in war situations. They don't have health insurance. They don't have pensions. They're working informally. They can't meet their monthly wage. They can't meet all their monthly basic expenses in most cases. And they just scrape through month to month. That's probably about 50% of the people in the Arab world. And these are people you probably don't see if you go visit the Arab countries. You fly to an Arab capital, you go to a hotel, you go to a meeting, you go to a conference, you go do some business. You're not going to see these people because they're invisible people. Like all the poor and the marginalized all around the world, you don't see them. But they're there, and they're getting bigger and bigger. And then there's the last 10% of the Arab world who I argue are still physically in the Arab world, but they've pulled out. They've pulled out of the system. They're no longer follow the government. They no longer participate in public life. They've created their own society, tribal groups, militant groups, religious groups, family groups. They're people who are still there but not there because they don't recognize the state anymore, and they've given up on the state serving them. But the real problem is that the environment in which we're trying to reconfigure our countries and not really being given the full freedom to do so because of constant wars and military foreign interventions. And our own governments in some cases, like if you look at what happened, say, in Syria or in Yemen or in Libya, when there was an uprising and then the government fought back militarily, it created terrible situations which exploded into civil war, and we see the consequences now. So people generally are not even given the opportunity to reconfigure their own societies into something that they think is reasonable and decent. And this is happening in a moment of incredible deterioration in the fundamental foundations of life. And this is increasing the desperation. And I'll give you a couple of statistics to support this. One survey that was recently done across the whole Arab region by the Arab Center in Doha, which does a tremendous survey every year of the whole Arab world, they showed that 78% 78%, that's almost 4 out of 5 people in the Arab world that were polled, say that they live in hardship or in need, meaning that they can either not cover their monthly expenses at all and they have to figure out how to get money. And we're just talking basic expenses. We're not talking a trip to London or a vacation in Cairo. We're talking about food, water, medical care, clothing, and heating oil in the winter. The very basic. 78% are living in hardship or need. You have about 25% of people over the age of 18, that means all adults, 25% want to immigrate. They just want to get the hell out of the Arab world. But if you take that critical age group, 25 to 30 years old, the most productive, probably the best educated, of the 25 to 30-year-olds in the Arab world, 2/3 are thinking of emigrating. They're seriously thinking about it if they can do it. Most of them don't have the opportunity. 93% of people surveyed in the Arab world see corruption as being very widespread and they can't do anything about it. And it's not just that they see corruption as something far away. They see corruption as the reason why their kids aren't ever going to get a decent job, or they don't have health insurance, or they can't afford medical care. There's a direct link between the vulnerability and the existential fear that families have with the corruption that they perceive in the systems around them. Only 24% of people surveyed, again, this is the whole Arab world, only 24% see the rule of law as being applied universally and consistently. In other words, 3/4 of people in the Arab world don't see a fair application of the rule of law. And by the way, that corruption figure, 93% see corruption as widespread. 68% of youth, people like under the age of 29, 68% also say that they don't see any chance that their governments are going to stop corruption. In other words, they don't just see themselves as suffering because of the corruption. They see themselves as perpetually and eternally suffering, and their children to the 10th generation. That this is the helplessness that drove the Arab uprisings, that they're in a bad situation and they can't do anything about it. They're never going to get out of it. And this is supported by other evidence. For instance, education. One of the most frightening situations that exist in our region is education outcomes based on standardized universal testing that's done all over the world. A recent series of surveys in around 2014, 2015, and situations have gotten worse in the last 3 years, so it's worse now, but the most recent data that we have shows that about 50% on average, it's actually a little higher, it's like 51 or 52, but around 50% of mid-primary and mid-secondary school students are not learning to read and write and do basic arithmetic. And they're still in school. And the reason they're still in school is the systems are so badly managed and so corrupt that the governments don't want the teachers to fail these students or hold them back. They just say, pass them on to the next level. And these kids go up from grade after grade. They have no idea what they're doing in class. Most of them drop out before they get into middle secondary school. And therefore, you have about half of the kids. I mean, that's an extraordinary number. There are about 75 million, roughly 75 million primary and secondary school children in Arab primary and secondary schools. About half of them will not graduate and will not learn anything in their school years and will drop out. Already, we have about 20 to 22 million already are out of school who should be in school. So you put those 20 million who are already out, and you take another 30 million who are in school but not learning anything, are going to drop out. So you got right there 50 million. I mean, I can't imagine that, but 50 million young Arabs aged 6 to 18 today are a time bomb of our own making, a weapon of our own, a weapon of self-destruction that we created by our own biological process and our own incompetent governance and our own uncaring social and political attitudes across the region, 50 million young kids today are either out of school or are not learning anything in school. What's going to happen to these kids? Well, here's what's going to happen to them. They're going to drop out of school and they're going to go and find any work they can do for $2 or $3 or $4 or $5 a day, depending on which country they live in. They're in a rural area or local area, or work on a farm and just get paid the food that they can take home or something. So what's going to happen is that the labor market trends that we're already suffering from are going to get much worse. And the labor market trends that we suffer from is, first of all, the highest youth unemployment in the world, around 25%, which has increased about 5% since 2010. Just since the uprisings, youth unemployment across our region has gone up from about 25 to around 30%. I mean, that's quite extraordinary, the highest in the world, twice the global average of youth unemployment in the Arab countries. Informality, informal labor, is the defining characteristic of our labor markets of employment, which means people who work without a contract, no minimum wage, no maximum working hours, no health precautions, no pension, no insurance, nothing. They're like mules. They're not human beings. They're like machines or mules. They just work, they do what they're supposed to do. Unskilled labor for the most part. They pick potatoes, they clean dishes, they sweep a floor, and or they deliver falafel sandwiches or whatever, and they get paid their $3, $4, $5 a day, and they go home and they give it to the family, and they hope that enough of their kids in the family do that and they can get through to the next month. But the frightening thing is that the average of informal labor in the Arab world, nobody knows exactly because statistics are not very good. But the best studies that I've seen, done by various serious international and regional associations who've studied this, is that the average is around 60%. And it's rising. It's an extraordinary figure. So you look at the education outcomes, you look at labor informality, and then what do you end up with? Large-scale poverty, widening disparities. The poverty figures, again, it depends how you measure it, $2 a day, $4 a day. There's all these different arguments about how do you measure poverty. And then, of course, you take countries like Syria, Yemen, Libya, you just stop measuring it there because it's a total war situation. But you're talking about poverty rates that are somewhere in the range of 20 to 30% in most countries. And in some cases, if depending on how you measure it, if you measure it by, say, $2.75 a day, which is the one measure that people use, in Egypt, it's around 40%. And Egypt is not a country at war. They have their problems, but they're not a country at war. And they have a strong central government. And they're massively supported internationally. And they have about 40% poverty rate. And if you take the post-2010 poverty rate in Egypt after the uprisings, it rose from 4.1 to 7.4% in the last 7 years. So these figures, and so I'm going to stop giving you figures there because I don't want to depress you too much, but I'm just giving you insights. If you look at water, you look at electricity access, you look at housing conditions, you look at public transport, you look at almost real GDP growth, you look at almost any criterion or measure. It's bad and it's deteriorating. It's deteriorated since the 1990s, and it's gone down in the last 7 years during the uprisings. In the meantime, population growth continues to be high. In some countries, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, and I think Yemen, or no, Oman, population growth, fertility rate of women has increased in the last 5 years, which is extraordinary. It's against all human experiences around the world, where development, women's education, economic growth, better healthcare brings down the fertility rate. And it did in our countries. For the last 30 years, fertility came down steadily. Almost it was cut in half, the population growth rate in the last 25, 30 years. But now it's rising again in a few countries. About 9 million Arabs are born every year, 9 to 10 million across the region. In Egypt alone, almost 2 million are born every year. So in the last 7 years, there's been something around 13, 14 million Egyptians born. It's quite amazing. I mean, God bless them all. They're all God's children. We love them all. We love all Egyptians. But they couldn't feed, clothe, and give jobs and medical care to their population in 2010. How are they going to do it with another 12 or 14 million? Well, the answer is they can't, and they're not. And that's why you see increasing stresses internally across the board. So these are just sample figures I'm giving you, all of them based on verifiable facts from UN agencies, World Bank, national studies, surveys by governments of all these issues. So it's in this environment that there are attempts by people all across our region, governments and non-government people, to try to reconfigure these societies, fix them up. And it's not doing very well because the constraints of these structural weaknesses and disparities that create fear and helplessness and desperation in the minds of maybe half the population, it makes it almost impossible to do that with zero, except for Tunisia, zero real improvement in political participation and accountability. There isn't a single Arab country outside of Tunisia, and I would say this confidently, there isn't a single Arab country, and I've lived through the last 50 years of the Arab world, where you can say that the structure, the system of governance, and the policies of the state have either been shaped or validated by the citizenry. In other words, we have independent Arab countries, but they're neither really sovereign nor are they really self-determinant. They're not really sovereign in the sense that decisions for these countries are increasingly made by external forces, exemplified by the extraordinary situation today where Turkey, Russia, Iran, and other people are meeting in Vienna to create a constitution for Syria. And the Syrians are there, but they're not really making the main decisions. And so this is just an example of most Arab governments, I would argue, don't really exercise total sovereignty in their countries. And none of them have really self-determinant systems. The Tunisians are the one exception, and we hope they'll succeed. In terms of the citizens of these countries have not fully validated, haven't been given the opportunity to validate these systems or their policies. And this creates this incredible stress, which in the last 20, 25 years has started to come apart. And that's when I say the citizen-state relationship is fracturing, and it's due to bad governance, it's due to corruption, it's due to foreign interference, the Arab-Israeli conflict. There's many reasons. I don't have time to get into that, but this is the situation that we're left with today, and the trends are troubling because we have an increasingly urban population with dropping water tables, environmental stresses, people leaving agricultural areas because there's not enough water to farm and keep a decent life in many areas. Big populations with a lot of young people who are not well educated, not well employed. So these trends are very troubling, and they're compacted into urban centers. So Cairo, Casablanca, Amman, Damascus, Beirut. When you travel around this, when you get out of the fancy hotel districts on the seafront Corniche, and you go to the peri-urban belts, and you go to the areas of Cairo where the government doesn't really have a lot of influence or even presence, and the services and the identity and the participation and the voice and the basic needs of people are more and more met by non-governmental institutions, whether tribal or religious or family or neighborhood or whatever they may be, or charitable societies, foreign groups, or UN, whatever. That's where you see this. So we don't only have a problem with foundational stresses in our region that prevent a real serious reconfiguration because of the lack of political opportunities for citizens and governments to come together and figure out what's the problem and solve it, because we could do that. We can solve all of these problems. We created them. We know how to solve them. But that process is not happening. And there are no serious mechanisms at hand in which we can start to make this transition. International pressure is not doing anything. And in the meantime, the Arab-Israeli conflict continues to increase the tensions and frustrations and humiliations that people feel all over the region because of constantly all these Arab powerful countries being humiliated by this one little country, and foreign powers doing what they're doing. So it's a very bad situation, but I would argue that it's a situation that we know how to fix up because we know how we got here. And I've given you a very simple, superficial analysis pointing out some of the markers and some of the dangers, but these are also pointers to how we get out of here. We know how we got here. We know how to get out of here, but there isn't any clear indication that this is going to happen in the near future. So it'll probably stay bad for some time until something happens. And other societies have been through situations like this, where suddenly people wake up to the fact that they can't continue like this. And they can't all immigrate. 400 million Arabs can't immigrate. And who knows what that turning point will be. But I hope that we will see it starting to happen soon. And my guess is we're going to start seeing it happening in local communities first, and then hopefully it'll expand into the national stage. But institutions like yours have an important role to play. AUB, where I work and teach in Beirut, the American University, we have an important role to play to analyze these societies at the first level, to study what's going on accurately, honestly, without fear. And if there's a problem, we should say there's a problem and understand how it happened so we can then know how to fix it. Thank you very much.
So I don't know how to say this. Thank you very much. I'm very happy that we don't have a third night with you, because I will be sleepless for less. So not so optimistic this evening either. Floor is open for questions and comments. I'll begin in the back. Wait for the microphone, so we'll have listeners online, please.
Thank you for your talk. You touched on the Palestinian-Israeli.
Put the mic closer to you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
You touched on the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. Could you talk about a little bit about the citizen-state relationship in the between the Palestinian Authority and its citizens?
Well, the Palestinian condition is doubly burdened by the fact that the governance system of the Palestinians, well, it's burdened by the fact that it's a society under occupation or siege by Israel and is not fully in control of itself, its land or its resources. And it's doubly burdened by the broad trend that I mentioned in the Arab world of poor living conditions, deteriorating conditions, and political autocracy. We suffer that in Palestine to a large extent. We did have a period in the 90s and 80s and 90s where we did have vibrant political participation through the institutions of the Palestine National Council and other things. That was very short-lived. And then after Oslo, Arafat and Fatah took control and did not do any serious consultation. In Gaza later, Hamas took over. So Palestine suffers more or less the same political autocracy problems, deteriorating life conditions, but all of it under the bigger burden of Israeli occupation or siege in most places. And the world helps. They give money, they support us, they vote at the UN, but they don't really go out of their way. It's not seen as a priority problem for the world.
Yeah, many thanks for this great talk. I really learned a lot from it. I just have two questions actually. The first one is, to what extent what you describe is really the result of something much larger than the Arab world. You talked about like local actors. I call them, well, regional actors and even local actors. But to what extent it's really also the result of, what we call globalization. That is like this globalization, yeah, meaning like the rule of the market, the neoliberal policies that are aggressively applied, not only in the Arab world, but also everywhere. What you described about the Arab world is true. I mean, it's very correct, actually. It seems to me it's very severe in Arab countries, but it also exists in other countries, including in developed countries.
You're saying it does or doesn't?
No, it does exist.
It does exist.
The poverty level in the United States, in France, is much higher. Education is much worse situation in the United States and in France now. Especially you have like the creation of these kind of private grands écoles that really kind of like they are, for the elite, whereas the masses and the middle classes, and they are sent to these kind of public schools that are pretty much like they just produce unemployment and even illiteracy. So that's the first question. So the second question is, you didn't want to talk about the turning point, but I would like to ask you about that actually, because you talked earlier about one of the causes of the uprisings. So the uprisings was precisely the fact that people were desperate. There was so much hopelessness. But right now, it seems to me, it's really there's a tricky situation in the sense that people do not want to protest. They do not want to go to the street. As a matter of fact, they do not even want change because they say it over and over again. We don't want to become like Syria, or we don't want to become like Libya, or we don't want to become like Yemen. So the situation, as bad as it is, let's just be happy with it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those. You're right. I mean, all of the world suffers many of these problems, but there isn't a single other entire region in the world, like the Arab region, that suffers all of these problems over a long period of time. That's what makes us different. So it's true, you have poverty, you have low education, you have corruption in other places, but nobody has it to the extent that we've had it. Nowhere else in the world do you get 15 countries where you've had rulers who've been in power for 30 or 40 years, and then they try to put their children in power. And in the meantime, they've depleted their underground water resources. They've seen their labor forces completely pulverized. And so that's only happened in the Arab world. So it's the convergence of many different factors that have brought us to this very difficult situation. There's a lot of good things in the Arab world. I've pointed out only the bad ones. And the fact that we haven't had complete, people burning down all of our cities is pretty amazing. But it hasn't happened because people are patient. They love each other. They know that they can fix these situations. They help each other. Poor people get help from their neighbors, from the mosque, from the church, from the local charitable society. There's many positive things in Arab societies that have happened over the years. Most Arab men and women, with a few rural places in Morocco or Yemen, most Arab men and women and kids can walk to a health center on their feet. Most of them, not all of them, but that's incredible that basic access to some basic needs has been provided pretty well over the years. Drinking water is increasingly accessible to people, but it's increasingly unfit. It's increasingly erratic. So people who have water pumped into their homes now may get it twice a week, maybe only once a week. And when we turn on our taps in parts of Beirut and other Arab cities, you can feel the salinity in the water because the water table has dropped and the seawater is coming in. So the good things that have happened and the basic goodness of human nature in Arab society and culture have mitigated some of the desperation that might happen. But the trend is what's troubling to me.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. If I may start with a very short comment. You mentioned something about the Arab culture or religious system that support people to speak up and say whatever they want to say. And if I may differ here, that it's not the case in most of the Arab world where the religious system embedded, it's built in the religious system that you are not allowed to say no for your ruler. And the real example, what happened in Egypt between 2005 2011, it's been the 10,000, 20,000 brave people belong to Kifaya and other groups, protest group, who used to go to Minan Tahrir and stand alone, where other religious groups were saying, no, we're not doing this. This is against our principles. And they withdrawn in the first 18 days from Tahrir Square. This is very clear. Just a short comment I wanted to make because I witnessed it myself. My question again belongs to the struggles, the constitutional struggles in the Muslim world or the Arab world in the last 100 years. I was wondering if you can just say a little bit more about the constitution and the problems in the Arab constitutions and its impact on the current situation.
Thank you. On the first point, you're right. The systems, the religious institutions and the political institutions as they exist don't allow people to challenge them. But the Quran does, and the Hadith do, and the values in people's minds and hearts do. And that's what I'm saying, is that people instinctively know that they should not put up with being abused by their own societies or by foreign occupiers or whatever. But they've never been able to implement that, and that's exactly the problem with our constitutions. To your second point, most of what we in the turn of the century in 1905 to 1920, we copied. You had European opera houses that were built all over the place. You had people starting to wear European clothes in the Arab world. You had European industrial products imported, and then we also imported European constitutions. But we just partially copied the European constitutions, and we didn't fully implement the constitutional protections of people's rights, due process and human rights and political participation rights, because you did not have widespread popular participation in creating the constitutions. That's why I say there was no real validation of our political systems from the beginning. It was a small bunch of urban elites, usually, disproportionately with minority people in them, because that's what the Europeans felt most comfortable with. And they basically handpicked elites, and these political power structures were created. There was no mass consultation, and you had nothing comparable to some of the systems in Europe that were developed, or in the United States or Canada or other places, where some form of consultation and popular validation happened. We didn't have any of that. So the constitutions all say that all citizens are equal. They all have the right of free speech, for assembly, political participation, etc., except in every clause, except where prohibited by law or if it threatens national security and social calm and religious harmony. And of course, the state defines those things. So if I tell you your goatee beard is dangerous because you should have a beard like mine, and your goatee beard is dangerous, then I'm going to put you in jail, and I can do that legally. That's what I said before. They deny people's rights are denied according to the law of the land. And that's why these constitutions never got anywhere. The Tunisian example of the transition after 2011 was extraordinary. The process went on about almost 3 years, 2 to 3 years of incredible popular consultations on television and town hall meetings and parliament and the transitional authorities. They discussed the issues of Arabism, of Islam, of women's rights, of young people's rights, the freedom of the press. The most fundamental issues of constitutionalism were actually discussed by the Tunisian people, and they reached compromises on all of the difficult issues. That Tunisia is an Arab state mostly, but there's Tunisians who are not Arabs. They're Amazigh, Berbers. That Tunisia is an Islamic state mostly, but not all Tunisians are Muslims. So how do you account for that? And then they agreed that authority, governance or authorities inspired by God, Sharia, but promulgated by the elected parliament. So they found these incredible compromises that satisfied everybody. And that only has ever happened in Tunisia, in the Arab world. So we're hoping that it'll happen in other places as well.
Thank you for a really thought-provoking talk. My question is relating to kind of the local actors you were talking about, either non-state actors or civil society that are providing public services, and whether you think that helps to develop governance at a local level or actually hurts the relationship between citizen and state, because citizens aren't holding their governments to account because they're getting services from other organizations. So just wondering if it helps to build up or kind of disconnects.
Yeah, we've saw this starting in the 70s and 80s, really. It started in the, so one of the ways the Muslim Brotherhood expanded in a big way in the 1970s is they started helping poor people. They opened a clinic, they opened a food kitchen. If somebody was the father of the family, couldn't work, they gave them $50 a month or 50 dinars a month or something. Small scale local community stuff, which was always part of Arab society. The local neighborhood, the community, the village was always your primary unit of identity and assistance, solidarity among citizens. That started to expand in the 80s and 90s. And as the government slowly pulled out of some sectors, three basic groups took over. First of all, a lot of things were privatized. Cell phones, transportation, education, healthcare, electricity, water. Most of the things that had been traditionally provided by governments for the previous 9,000 years or 7,000 years were suddenly privatized. So you had to pay more for them. And in some places you had to actually pay twice. You pay the government for your water, and then you pay the private sector to bring in that extra tanker of water once a week, because the government's water doesn't suffice. It's not enough. So the private sector took part of it. Charitable societies, NGOs took part of it, and religious groups or tribal groups took the other part. All of these three people started playing a role to provide basic services that the government didn't provide. That's not so bad in itself. The bad part is that the citizens also wanted two other things. They wanted representation, and they wanted accountability. They wanted voice, representation, and they wanted accountability. They wanted to somehow hold power accountable for what they were not getting, or for their mistreatment, their sense of indignity. They were being dehumanized, they thought. And only the religious Muslim Brotherhood institution and others provided that. Political groups couldn't, because they were all pretty much had fizzled out. The nationalists, the socialists, the Baathists, the communists, the Ba'arif Shmin, and this and that. And all of these groups pretty much fizzled out by the 1990s. The religious rise of the Muslim Brotherhood groups and other groups, some more violent, but that was the major move that marked this transition and the beginning of the fragmentation. And then you had other groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, who played a national resistance role to Israeli occupation. And then you had people like Muqtada Sadr in Iraq, you had Ansarullah, the Houthis in Yemen, and so you had other groups who filled in a vacuum that was created by the retreat or the incompetence of the state. And so you ended up with, again, a very peculiar phenomenon, which is very prevalent in the Arab world. I don't know how common it is elsewhere. I don't think it is very much. But you had single states with dual sovereignties inside them. So inside Lebanon, you have Hezbollah and you have the government. They work together. Hezbollah is in the government, but they're also separate from it, militarily and other ways. You have groups in Iraq and Syria. Well, Syria is at war, but in Iraq and other places where you have large groups represented by their religious or tribal or political leaders, ethnic leaders, who work parallel with the state, but they're not part of the state. So this is, I think it's a bad thing, generally speaking, but if it's only a transitional process, then it may not be such a bad thing. If people find that there are ways that they can get water, healthcare, food, and a job, and a social safety net from these non-governmental groups, that might be a signal to the whole society that, well, we can do this. And maybe there'll be a transition process, by which the governments and these groups will sit down together and say, okay, let's try this one more time. We messed it up in 1920. Let's not mess it up today. It's possible. I mean, I would hope that would be the case. But in the meantime, people need water, food, jobs, and electricity, and physical protection, security protection. They need this. And as long as the government doesn't provide that anymore, and the governments did provide it until the late 1980s, if the government can't do it, then they're going to get it from somewhere else.
Thank you very much for this kind of socioeconomic analysis of what's happening in the Arab world. So my question is that about the current Arab states. To what extent?
The current what?
Arab states.
Arab states.
Governments. To what extent do you think it's a kind of the historical development of the unsettled battle between the secular thoughts and religious thought, Islamic religious thought, post the collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate and the shape of the national states in the post-colonial era? And also specifically about the definition of Arabness. I read once that most of the Arab states now are facing problems because they are giving it more kind of Islamic identity, while in essence Arabness, it was, let's say, it was brought up by the minority group against the Islamist people in the early 20th century. My other question is about the role of social media and satellite channels that they started showing up in the 90s and 2000s and afterwards. So to what extent actually they changed the nature of the relationship between the citizens and the states? And what's the role of Arab intelligentsia in that?
Okay, that's like 7 questions, but I'll put them all together and I'll answer them. They all fit together because they're all part of one process. Arab citizens have clearly indicated through social science analysis and mass surveys, and repeatedly, they've been saying this for the last 20, 30 years since big surveys have been done. They want their societies to be shaped by religious values. And what do they mean? They mean honesty, justice, equal opportunity, dignity. That's what they mean. They don't want religious men to rule them. They don't want an Iranian or a Saudi-style society. This is very clear. Religiosity is very high in Arab public sentiment, but they see religiosity as a relationship between God and them and their neighbors, to treat people nicely. They don't want rulers to be, they don't want religious rulers. The rise of religiosity in the public sphere, the politicization of religion, is a direct consequence, I believe, of the failure of the nationalist developmental state. The nationalist developmental state that worked from the 20s until the 70s was not at all threatened by mass religious movements. You had small movements, the Muslim Brothers, a little bit here with Nasser, but most people's lives were improving. And therefore, you didn't have mass rebellions in many Arab countries. You had 1 or 2, occasionally you had the uprising against Jafar Numeri in Sudan in the mid-80s, and then you had others that were like ethnic, the Kurdish uprising against Saddam. But what happened in the transition period I talked about was the nationalist developmental state transformed into a consumer security state, where security dominated the governance system, and the citizen, instead of having the promise of development, was given the promise of consumerism. And therefore, the 2 biggest rising movements in the Arab world in the last 20 years were jihadi people like Qaeda and ISIS. Ayman Zawahiri, Qaeda, the jihadis. I don't like to call them jihadis because jihad is a good thing for Muslims. I call them takfiri Salafi militants. They were the biggest rising. And what was the other biggest rising trend in the Arab world? Cell phone shops. You go into any Arab city, there's 900 cell phone shops. So the promise of the modern Arab state to its citizens was buy as many cell phones as you want. And next to cell phone shops was the expansion of malls. Malls are now being built all over the place. And so this is the modern security consumer state, and the development state has vanished. And so that religion came in to fill that gap between Arabism, nationalism, statehood, and development. The social media and satellite stations are a reflection of Arab society, not a creator of it. What you see in social media, what you see in Jazeera, is a reflection in the public sphere of what is happening in people's lives and in their minds. The important thing is that this is the first time that this is visible in the public sphere, because, as I said yesterday in my talk, the media controls of the last 70 years, since the curse of the information ministry that Nasser created, is that none of the true sentiments of people or their aspirations were ever allowed to be expressed in public in a major way. If they were quickly shut down. And that's why people left and came here and went to other places. But social media and satellite now gave a public voice. And that's why Jazeera became so popular. They had 50, 60 million viewers every night, because people looked at Jazeera and they saw themselves. And they were pleased. And that's why the uprisings, when they happened, there was a mass increase in Jazeera's following, because it was just reporting what was going on. And people wanted to know that, and they shared those sentiments.
Yes, please.
Hi. Just wanted to stress something, that Arab nationalism is a modern phenomenon. It's never been,
A moderate?
It's modern.
Modern.
Yes. And now we have in the United Nations, there's a problem, because Saudi Arabia.
Erbil, get the thing closer.
Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt, who are violators of human rights, are sitting on the United Nations Human Rights Council with the backing of United Kingdom and America. And this is, of course, is not going to help the situation of human rights. And Saudi Arabia now is leading the Arab world. We have an alliance between United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and Egypt is joining. They're bombarding Yemen with the weapons that we are supplying here in the United Kingdom. And this is not a way to get, things improving on the situation of the government. And don't forget that in 1840, Egypt fought the Wahhabis. We defeated them. It was supposed to be a heresy at the time. Now, a heresy is dominating the Muslim world now. And it's supported by Trump. Trump is asking them to reform Islam. And they have this concept of Hakimiyya. If we, Sharia is changing now, so that they kill any opposition. People, for instance, Sheikh al-Nimr, and any opposition, these bloggers, like Badawi, is in prison, received 2,000 lashes, and probably is going to receive a death sentence at the end. So there's no way, there's going to be any improvement in governance with the situation being what it is, because the West is supporting them, even in weapons. In Bahrain, you have a Shia wanted to control themselves, and look at how they crushed. In Iraq, the Sunni now have, the Shia is now governing, and they were the majority before. But don't forget, it's all about balance of power between the Saudis and the rest of the world.
Okay, I think those are all pretty correct comments. I agree with them. They are describing the situation we have today, which is a terrible situation. And it's been terrible for a long time. What did we have in 1917, and what do we have in 2017? We had Arthur James Balfour, and today we have Nikki Haley. I mean, that's a terrible historical journey. We have Jared Kushner and Nikki Haley. I mean, these are intellectual beasts who are exercising enormous power, playing with us, playing with Jerusalem, playing with the whole concept of Arab development in grotesque ways. And most of the world objects to it, but doesn't do anything. So the reality is we're in a very difficult situation, created by a combination of our own mismanagement and external intervention, including Arab-Israeli wars and Westerners and foreigners and all. So all of us are to blame. We're only going to get out of it if we figure out how in our societies we're going to start making transitions. These transitions, I think, are not going to happen instantly. The uprisings were a very powerful example of mass discontent and a desire for change, but they failed for many different reasons we don't have time to go into now. But the same sentiments that drove the uprisings are in societies all across the Arab world and are intensifying because the underlying conditions that I went through are worsening in every single case. There isn't a single positive sign that has the capacity to bring about change on a big scale. You have small signs. You have lots of, social entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurship is the latest thing in the Arab world. For the last 20 years, AID and the EU and Arif Shmeen, they're all saying, oh, entrepreneurs, and train these women entrepreneurs, and train these agricultural entrepreneurs, and train these social entrepreneurs. That's great. And they've trained a lot of people. 20 years ago, it was micro loans. So we had, 9,000 chicken farms that were created by, women and men in rural areas. It didn't have any impact on labor force informality, education standards, water availability, none of the, so these things all are good, helping women, helping entrepreneurs, helping youth, absolutely there are good things to do. But we haven't done any of them on a scale that impacts the entire population. How that's going to come about, I don't know. But I'm absolutely sure it will come about, because the people of the Arab world, suffering as they do, half of them suffering as they do in these vulnerable situations, can't put up with this. They, not only do they not want to, they can't physically. Their kids are going to run out of food. They're going to run out of water. All these terrible things are happening. You had hundreds of thousands of Syrians who had to leave the northeastern rangelands to come into the cities in the period of 2005 to 2010 because of drought and mismanagement of water resources, and they were a prime contributor to the uprisings in Syria. So the Yemen, the water situation we see, I mean, these trends are not sustainable. And people will reach desperation points much more quickly now than they did in the last 20 or 30 years. Combined with what you described as not only the uncaring international attitude, but the direct involvement in military aggression and criminal activity. So, Arab governments who are autocrats being in the UN Human Rights Council, to me, is pretty irrelevant, because the UN system hasn't shown it's wrong, I'm against it, but it has no real impact. That's not what we should be worried about. What we should be worried about the internal situation in these countries, and to try to push for a better human rights protections in our countries. Hundreds of people have tried to, hundreds of organizations have tried to do that in the last 40, 50 years. We just finished a massive study on human rights with Lund, where Leif was before, and AUB. We launched a massive study on human rights. We interviewed hundreds of people who worked on human rights in the last 40 years. It'll come out soon, and you'll see this extraordinary effort all across our region where people were trying to improve human rights, but they couldn't. They couldn't, because the autocratic powers were too strong, and they couldn't budge them. But, the Americans were very strong in Vietnam. The British were very strong in Boston 225 years ago. The French were very strong in Algeria. The Russians were very strong in Afghanistan, and they all left. And why did they leave? Because local people refused to suffer and wallow in their own indignity and in their own dehumanization and subservience to either their own autocrats or to foreign occupiers. It's human nature. It's just basic human nature. The ectoplasm doesn't put up with being denied food, bread, and water, and basic rights. So how this will come about, I don't know. None of us can see. But the uprisings were such a massive signal that we should be sure that there will be other developments, because these underlying conditions are still worsening.
I hope I'm not rude if I ask humbly for shorter questions and perhaps also shorter answers.
You said the same thing yesterday.
Did I?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do it.
It's part of your job description.
Yeah, I think it is, because there are 5 people who have asked to, I mean.
Okay, well, short questions, short answers.
Yeah, reasonable.
Thank you very much for a very useful presentation full of data and insight into Middle East. My first question actually goes back to the start of your presentation, in which you said that Islam has a religious provision that people can stand against an unjust ruler. So, and what do you think? What is your view? Why do religious cadre don't stand against the rulers? What is actually stopping them from recognizing this level of corruption? And you said that 93% of the population see their government as corrupt. And in 1980s, lots of people, especially educated people, moved out of Middle East out of desperation. So why do they fail to recognize that? What is stopping them? The other thing is
Could we'll keep it to one question each, because we're running out of time?
It relates to the other one, basically.
All right, really quick, I'll give you one answer.
People are moving out. So what is the future of Arab Spring, if there will be any, especially in relation to the diaspora who have left the Middle East now?
Okay, the Arab religious authorities and institutions are almost totally controlled by the states, to the point where most Arab governments, or many of them at least I know, they give the Friday sermon to the preachers and they have to basically read it out. So Arab religious institutions are a bit like Arab media institutions. They're totally controlled by the executive branch, which is totally under the control in most cases of the security institutions. So they've lost their independent role as purveyors of ethical norms and justice. They've simply become entertainers. And I mean, I say that I'm not being insulting to them, but they talk about religion, they talk about values and ethics, but they don't act like religion. You know, Martin Luther King was a religious leader. And the Berrigan brothers in the Vietnam War in the United States, these Catholic priests, the liberation theology of Christians in South America, that was, and the Pope now, Pope Francis, these are religious leaders who take their religiosity and try to put it into action, to say this is not just a book, this is God's message to us. It's also a way that he's telling us how we should act, and that's the problem with the religious institutions. And then the Arab Spring, the uprisings, I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know that there will be a movement change that'll be forced from within the Arab world in the years to come. That's absolutely guaranteed, but we'll see how it starts and where it comes.
I'd like to ask a question about Tunisia and why you think it was an exception during the Arab uprisings. What led it to become sort of participatory political culture that can make compromises? And also, in the absence of any sort of movement and from the political elites to share power, what kind of progress can be made in the wider Arab world towards this more participatory political culture at the sort of bottom-up level?
Well, the second part is I don't know. How change is going to happen, nobody knows. We'll see. But for the first part, I think it's pretty well known now. There's been tons of studies and books written about this, that there were 3 or 4 factors that were unique in Tunisia. The army did not play a political role historically. The society was quite secularized for many years under Bourguiba and others. The labor unions played an incredibly important, powerful role as mediators, and the Muslim Brotherhood leadership were in exile in Europe, whereas the Muslim Brotherhood leadership in Egypt were exiled in jail. But the Nahda of Tunis were in Europe, and they learned. Some of them here, they saw what was going on in relatively normal democratic societies and pluralistic societies. So the combination of those things allowed, and particularly the ability of Nahda to make compromises, the ability of the labor unions to mediate, and they had a set of really spectacular constitutional lawyers people like Yad bin Ashur and others. There was an amazing number of Tunisians, many of whom were French educated at one point, but they really knew constitutional law, and they understood that constitutionalism was the key to making the revolution succeed. And they had a committee to protect the gains of the revolution. And that's why they took their time in making the transitions. They went to elections a little early like everybody did, but those factors together basically explain why it succeeded. The situation in Tunisia is still fragile, but it's better than anywhere else in the Arab world. It's the only self-determinant Arab country that we've ever had.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. I think I understand that you are supporting the Uprisings, and I am optimistic.
Yeah.
You are supporting, or at least you are optimistic about the Uprisings happening in the Arab world.
I didn't say uprising. I said something's going to happen. I don't know what it is, but something.
I mean, you are optimistic about the movement.
In the long run, yeah. I'm not saying it's going to happen next year, but it has to happen.
Yeah, I'm talking because I'm Libyan, so I know exactly what's happening in Libya, and I am not really. I am very, very optimistic about the change because, for example, in Libya, I'm not judging the situation in Libya based on the chaos which we have now, but about the change of the mentality of the people, because people start openly discussing their problems and expressing their needs. And this is a really very good movement. I mean, this is how the nations can build themselves. My question really about something else, about the identity, because you see, in Arab countries, it was common that we are calling ourselves Arab, or maybe we present ourselves as Muslims. But now, after this uprising, there are ethnic issues appear, like, for example, Kurdish in Iraq and in Syria, Amazigh in Libya, Tunis, Algeria, and so on. So what's your view about this identity? I mean, what kind of the development will happen in the identity of these nations?
I think it's up to the people of those countries to answer that question. I would be presumptuous to try to answer that question. The only thing I can do as a journalist is to analyze the situation and say that historically, there was a real element of common shared values and identities in the region among people who spoke Arabic and called themselves Arabs. And that's all Arabism is. It's people who spoke Arabic and called themselves Arabs and felt some kind of shared something or other, heritage, future, destiny, solidarity, whatever. And we saw it expressed in many ways. Some of the leaders took advantage of it, and many of them were corrupt and violent and militaristic and autocratic, but they understood this and they tried to exploit it and play with it. But it was real, but it was very superficial, because never were the people of our countries given the opportunity to explain how they would like to translate that common sentiment into anything else. Unlike what the Europeans experienced, where they had this sense of being common European values, simply geography, basically, and some political values and economic self-interest, the European people were repeatedly given the chance to translate that common sense of identity and self-interest into mechanisms of governance and transport and tariffs and this and that. And then to go back with Brexit and stuff, you can reverse it. Because if this is what the people want, if the citizenry is allowed to, the consent of the governed is a fact of life in Europe. The consent of the governed in the Arab world has never happened, except in Tunisia. That's the difference. But Arabism remains a reality, even if it's a very informal, emotional reality, it's still there. And people have to decide in future what they want. Internally, these governments are, some will be decentralized, some states will be decentralized, some states might split. I mean, South Sudan already left, and North Iraq more or less left, and others may split, but they might come up with more federal systems. Who knows? Whatever they choose is the right choice, because it's up to them to make that choice and live with it.
Okay, last question.
I just wonder whether you agree with my contention that Arabs like to collaborate with their own oppression. If you look at the case of European Zionistes were plotting 150 years ago to colonize the Palestine, and the selling of lands by the Arabs and the Saudi, you see, collaborating with the Americans. And the current situation, if you look at that, where Saudi Arabia collaborating with Israel against the very interests of the Arab humanitarianism. So I wonder whether, you see, Edward Said has written so much about Oslo project and all that, and the way the Palestinians govern themselves, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, not collaborating and making some sort of joint operation, is so sad that it's very unlikely that they will ever improve.
Well, I disagree with most of what you said. I agree with you that it's sad. It's so sad. I disagree with you that Arabs delight in their own oppression. I think that's totally wrong. You've been reading too much journalism in London. You've got to read stuff from the Arab world. There are small elites in the Arab world who collude with foreign parties, colonialists in the past, Israelis today. Yes, there are small groups of people, some of them in leadership positions. They will not succeed. I don't think they can succeed because there's just massive popular opposition to that. They do this because they see this as the route to their own security and incumbency. And the same way that people did it in 1925 with England and France. And of course, we saw the mess that eventually ultimately created. If you disregard your own citizens and seek solace or security in the guns and money of foreigners, you can do that for 10 years, 20 years, but you can't do it forever. And I think the situation is that the small elites in some countries are doing what you're saying, but this is not a common Arab sentiment. That most of these activities by most people in the Arab world are seen as treasonous. But people do it. This is what leaderships all around the world do. They do crazy, stupid things and desperate things. And the reason they do it is because there are not mechanisms in society that allow any kind of accountability pressures from their own people to rein them in and stop them from doing these kinds of things. The Palestinian leadership made terrible mistakes after Oslo. People were willing to give them a little bit of benefit of the doubt for a couple of years, but it was clear by 1995, 96 that it wasn't going to work, and they should have stopped it right away. But once you get a VIP pass, and once you get a monopoly on selling certain cell phone systems, because the great leader gave you those rights, it's hard to give those up. And then you try to convince your people that they should all go out and buy your cell phones and be happy. So these are normal mistakes that people make all over the world and throughout history. There's nothing unusual about them happening in the Arab world. But basic dignity, basic rights, basic human decency will prevail, because those are the values that shape 397 million of the 400 million Arabs. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we also include a thank you to the staff from ISNC who have spent 2 nights helping out in organizing this. So thank you to the staff.